So we've been learning about spiritual beings in the Bible, and I still have a lot of questions about the bad ones.
Well, great. Let's talk about the Satan and demons in the story of the Bible. So let's start in the beginning.
This one is about demon sex.
Oh, boy.
What we say in the video is one of the strangest stories in the Bible is in Genesis 6.
Yes, it is.
First few verses
Strange
there.
to us.
Strange to us.
Strange to modern Westerners.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you want to take it literally, they are the spawn of fallen spiritual beings.
Yeah.
You take it figuratively, and they're possessed by it.
Remember, we just recently interviewed Reuben Evans, producer of The Unseen Realm, and almost all of Dr. Michael Heiser's efforts, documentary-wise, were produced by Reuben Evans. And that was an amazing interview that really pricked my interest in this subject. So I've gone down the rabbit hole, and I want you guys to come with me. I don't want you to take my word for it. Let's listen to these scholars, but ultimately let's listen to the Bible, and let's listen to its supernatural focus and how Jesus has defeated evil and death. And that's ultimately what I want this to bring us to, is not to a place where we're in fear of these supernatural beings that are in control of the nations. No, it's to understand the story and narrative that Jesus found himself in. And that supernatural focus of the Bible, Jesus defeated those powers of darkness, and we have victory in him. And that's what I want to bring, is peace. I want to bring understanding, and I want to bring joy to you and to me. And I think this supernatural focus of the Bible with the Satan, demons, and the divine counsel is going to bring us there. So you guys enjoy.
Multiple puzzles at work in the snake. One thing to clarify, the snake is not called the Satan in that story.
Right.
That's a title that's going to come to be associated with this arch rebel, spiritual rebel, later on in the Hebrew Bible. So we'll just call it the snake.
Okay.
So there's two options. One is that the snake had its own rebellion, and that story is not narrated in Genesis, but it's presumed, and then you get the backstory later on in the Bible. Another possibility is that Genesis 3 is telling you the rebellion story of the snake and the human simultaneously.
That is his rebellion.
That it's the fall of the snake and the fall of Adam and Eve in the same story.
The Bible asks us to believe a lot of strange things about the spiritual world. At first, we might be tempted to ignore them, but if we say we believe the Bible, we can't avoid these concepts. Much of what we think we know about the spirit world isn't true. It's been filtered down through centuries of church tradition. Angels do not have wings. Demons don't have horns or tails. And for the biblical writers, the unseen realm was home to more than angels and demons. There were other, bigger players. So do you believe what's in your Bible?
Okay, let's start with a handful of biblical passages that are just clear as day about this. Bible nerds, biblical scholars, have come to refer to this category or this idea, this theme, in the Old and New Testaments as the divine counsel. So
this theme that you're about to tell us about?
It's called the divine counsel.
Okay.
In other words, it's language and imagery depicting God as like a commander-in-chief of a staff of Elohim.
Yeah.
Of other
a
spiritual
king with
beings.
his lieutenants.
Yeah, so whether it's a king, with his...
A general with his lieutenants or something.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. The divine counsel.
Okay.
And there's a handful of passages that actually use this language of commander-in-chief type of situation. So, in the book of Kings, 1 Kings chapter 22, there's a prophet Micaiah who's brought before Ahab, one of the kings of Israel, and Micaiah tells him what the God of Israel wants to say. So he says, I had this vision. Hear the word of the Lord. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven were standing by him on his right and on his left. You get the scene here. It's Yahweh, the chief Elohim, and then there's all these other beings on flanking.
Well, yeah, that's a weird translation, host of heaven.
So, okay, here we go. Host of heaven.
Yeah.
So you know the word heaven, skies.
Yeah.
So it's the entities that populate the skies.
There are some terms that we should sort of camp on just a little bit. One of those is Elohim. A biblical writer will actually use Elohim of God, the God of the Bible, and lots of lesser beings. Okay, the gods of the nations. Psalm 82, the members of God's council, his entourage, the heavenly host. It will use Elohim of the disembodied dead in 1 Samuel 28. It will use Elohim of the Shadim in Deuteronomy 32:17, again, which usually gets translated demons, but really is a territorial entity. But however we understand that, it's not the God of Israel. It's something lower, but it's still Elohim. And the reason why that's okay for a biblical writer to do is that Elohim is just a term you would use as a label on anything that by nature is a disembodied member of the spiritual world, good or evil. It's just if you're a disembodied entity and your natural estate is the spiritual world now, you're an Elohim.
In Genesis 1, God creates a beautiful, ordered reality out of darkness and disorder so that life can flourish. He appoints humans as his representatives to rule over all of it, and 7 times God calls it good.
Yeah, I experience that kind of goodness often in the world, in things like beauty and truth, love and generosity.
But in Genesis 3, we meet a creature who's in a state of rebellion against his creator. We're not told yet why or how he rebels, but he's on a mission to ruin God's good world for other creatures.
This thing is trouble.
Yeah, this creature is the Bible's first portrait of evil. It distorts what God has purposed for good, ruining and dragging creation back into darkness and disorder.
So the humans join the spiritual rebel, which leads them back into chaos and death.
And from this point on, the human rebellion is interwoven with a spiritual rebellion. And the biblical story shows how this happens over and over again.
We've all heard about the serpent in Eden, but why a serpent? What's that supposed to tell us? Ancient people knew how to take this scene, but we don't. We assume the serpent is merely an animal. His form is important, but the story is not about zoology. The story is about a supernatural rebellion. Isaiah alludes to that rebellion.
I will raise up my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mountain of assembly. I will make myself like the Most High.
Isaiah is talking about the sons of God in the assembly. Just like Job, he refers to them as stars. They were present before Eden. Ancient Mesopotamian tablets talk about cherub throne guardians and describe them as snakes and dragons. The serpent of Eden was actually a supernatural being whose job was to guard God's throne. An ancient person would have known the scene was about a rebel in the divine council.
And I actually think that's there's some textual details that point in that direction. For example, the snake is introduced as the beast of the field, and it's arum in Hebrew.
Crafty?
Well, it gets translated crafty, but if you do a word search on arum in the Hebrew Bible, it's like under 10 other occurrences, and it's always a positive trait of being smart and shrewd, is sometimes perceptive.
Yeah. It's not far from the word for wisdom.
Correct. In other words, it's used a lot in the book of Proverbs, and it's a positive trait to be arum.
Yeah.
So the snake is introduced in the first sentence with a positive wisdom trait. It's a perceptive, clever creature. And what's interesting, that's he's said arum mikol habehemot, crafty more than all the beasts of the field. What he ends up is being arur mikol habehemot, cursed more than all the beasts of the field. So within the course of the narrative, he goes from being arum to arur, more than all the beasts. And I think that's the literary design.
It's his Breaking Bad.
Yes, yeah, totally. He's a good creature gone bad.
Yeah.
So this presumes what is the creature. In the video, we draw a whole bunch of design patterns from all over the Hebrew Bible. They also use a variety of images to describe this being. It's a snake, or a sea dragon, or a dark desert creature, or the king of death in the grave. He's also given many titles, like Tempter, or the Evil One, or the Devil, which in Greek means the slanderer. Design patterns from all over the Hebrew Bible that point in the direction of that snake being a spiritual being in disguise, namely one of the cherubim/seraphim.
Yeah, so if the garden was a place where all of God's creatures lived, where the humans were meant to rule,
correct,
then it wouldn't be strange to have one of the cleverest creatures there. All the creatures are there.
Yeah, the cherubim are there. We meet them at the end of chapter 3.
We know their garden.
So Adam and Eve are hanging out with
creatures.
With heavenly creatures that surround the divine throne.
What happened? The answer lies in God's decision to share his attributes with both his supernatural and human children. And one of those attributes is freedom, or free will. It is freedom, not mere intelligence, that allows for meaningful choices. God didn't program his children like robots. If he did, we wouldn't truly be like him. Having freedom meant God's children might choose to rebel. That's what happened.
Eden was the home and headquarters of God. His supernatural and earthly families resided there. God wanted them to image him in their own ways. Heaven and earth blended together into one family, but one family member didn't like that idea.
That's the picture you get. Heavenly creatures, earthly creatures, overlapping, God's space, our space together. That's the garden. So from that perspective, God isn't like, I know this guy's trouble, but I'm going to let him in.
Yeah.
It's like, no, he's just part of God's good creation.
Yeah, and so this is key, because sometimes the Satan figure is talked about as if he is essential evil and has always been so.
Okay.
So the story portrays him as a fallen creature, just like the humans are going to be fallen creatures.
Yeah. Okay, but wait, we're getting all this from a slithering snake?
Well, there are clues in the story that it's more than just a snake. Remember, Eden is a high place where the earth and its creatures overlap with heaven and its creatures.
So the snake could be a spiritual being.
Well, Genesis 3 points in that direction, and then later biblical authors fill in the picture. Like when the prophet Isaiah has a vision of God's heavenly throne room, he's surrounded and being praised by the spiritual beings.
Yeah, these are the cherubim around God's throne.
But when Isaiah sees these creatures, he describes them as seraphim, which in Hebrew means snake.
So the snake is like a former staff member in God's throne room. So why is he talking to the humans?
Well, the prophet Ezekiel understood this figure as a spiritual rebel who didn't want to live under God's wisdom and authority. He wanted to be God.
All right, that's the same temptation the snake puts before Adam and Eve.
Exactly. He says they could rule the world like God, but by their own wisdom.
So they're all kicked out of the garden.
Yeah, God says this rebel will now crawl on its belly.
Where does it go after this?
Well, the biblical authors offer subtle clues where this being is at work behind the scenes, animating division and hatred between humans. And this is, when you read the Gospels, this is what Jesus was constantly talking about.
Yeah.
This is why he didn't start a revolutionary war against Rome.
Because Rome was captive to something greater.
Yeah, he went out to the desert for 40 days to conquer the real enemy. That was tempting him to take the kingdom of God over the world, but through violent force.
Yeah.
And he resisted that, and he went about confronting a spiritual enemy that had captured a lot of people's bodies and minds and hearts. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of Luke, and he's getting arrested, he calls it, "This is the time for the power of the dark." That's what he says.
If you go back and you look at the first rebellion, Genesis 3, again, the figure that will eventually become known as Satan. The word Satan in Hebrew is not in Genesis 3. The serpent is never actually called Satan in the Hebrew Bible, in the whole Old Testament. This is how it works in the Old Testament. The first rebel gets cast down to the Eretz. That's a Hebrew term for ground or land. It's also a term that can be used of the underworld. Why? Because in Israelite cosmology, the underworld was actually inside the earth. This is the realm that was associated with death. Why? Because you bury people when they die. And the being who's in charge of this, or who's the cause of all this, is this figure from Genesis 3 who has been cast down to this place. Instead of being like the Most High or above the stars of God, no, now you're going to be like beneath the feet of mortals, the ones that you sought to lead astray and destroy. So we get the kernel thoughts that actually are systematized in the New Testament.
The Satan means the adversary, because he isn't for anything, rather he's anti-everything, working through lies to drag us back into darkness and disorder.
That's intense.
It was a personal journey of discovery when I learned Greek and Hebrew, and I noticed that every time that word refers to the spiritual arch-rebel, it has the word the in front of it, in Old Testament Hebrew and in the Greek New Testament, every time.
Yeah.
So, and then second, the words in biblical Hebrew, that noun, the Satan, refers to more figures than just the spiritual rebel.
Yeah.
It can refer to a king who rises up to rebel against King Solomon. There's 3 Satans in 1 Kings chapter 11, and there are other kings.
Yeah.
And the word the is not used
Oh, interesting.
for those. It's just a Satan,
A Satan.
which it's just an adversary. An
Yes.
enemy.
Something with Balaam,
Yes,
right?
yes, totally. The angel of Yahweh,
The
the
angel
angel of the
Yahweh
Lord,
is described
appears,
as Satan.
stands as a Satan
Yeah.
against Balaam.
So stands as one opposed.
Yeah, and it doesn't have the word the in front of
Okay.
it. But when, in biblical narratives, when this spiritual rebel is described, it's described as the Satan. So it's using the title, the adversary, and attaching the word the in front of it. So to me, that's important because I think giving this, whatever this creature is, I think giving it a proper name assigns a bit too much honor and dignity to it. Because the whole point is this being is anti-creation. He's anti-good.
Yeah.
And the biblical authors don't ever assign it a name. They assign this creature images and titles. So I'm just trying to be honest, I'm just trying to imitate the biblical language about this creature.
Yeah.
And I think using the word the, I don't know. So it's a quiet revolution to redefine our language about the Satan. And because it's how Jesus himself and the apostles also used the word the.
Talk about the powers of darkness, you have to devote some attention to Satan. Let's talk about Satan. Most people, when they think of Satan, they will think of Genesis 3, or they'll think of Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, what scholars call the prologue of the book of Job. So we have a meeting, a divine council meeting. The sons of God are assembled, and then in English Bibles, Satan, capital S, shows up. And God says, hey, where have you been? What are you doing? And he said, I've been running to and fro throughout the whole earth, and so on and so forth. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? Boy, he's awesome, and he talks Job up. And then Satan says, yeah, that's because he has a great life. If you took away everything that he had, he would curse you to your face. I mean, there's a confrontation there. And that launches us into what happens to Job. It raises certain questions. Well, why is Satan there? Is he still working for God? Is he on the payroll? What's going on here? And those are legitimate questions that we should talk about. But if you go down to Genesis 3, we get the familiar serpent in Eden story. And we don't get, even in English Bibles, we don't get the word Satan in Genesis 3. And that's because the Hebrew term for Satan is Satan. It doesn't show up in Genesis 3. It's never used. In fact, you never get the term Satan applied to the serpent, Nachash, that's the Hebrew term for serpent in Genesis 3. You never get those two terms married to each other in the Old Testament, speaking of Eden. The Satan figure in Job 1 and 2 really isn't the devil. Hebrew does not attach the definite article, that's the word the, in front of a proper personal name, and neither does English. So I'm not the Mike. I wouldn't talk about myself as the Mike. Every time the word Satan occurs, it has the definite article. So it's ha-Satan, the Satan. That tells you it's not a proper personal name. It's not a specific entity. Are we going to go with what the biblical text has or what our tradition tells us? So what we have in Job 1 and 2 is we have a member of the spiritual world, in this case sort of a functioning member of a board meeting. He's not evil and sinister. He's actually doing his job. Satan as a noun means adversary, that's true. But it could also mean something like challenger or someone who looks around for people who are obeying or disobeying God and then reports on them. The whole point of these metaphorical descriptions is to remind us that God doesn't miss anything. It's all in the memory bank. It's all there. Nothing is overlooked. Where it sort of transitions from I'm doing my job to challenging or becoming adversarial in relation to God is when he questions God's assessment of Job. So he's questioning God's omniscience of the situation. He's also questioning God's integrity. Is God telling us the truth about Job? God says to the Satan, okay, I'll let you do anything to Job that you want to do other than kill him, because we have to keep him alive so that his integrity will become known. And I'm going to let you do whatever you want because I don't want you coming back here and saying, oh yeah, Job would have folded if you'd have let me do this. No, do whatever you want. And we'll see who's right. This isn't the devil. So the question is, well, why does this term, Satan, get applied to the serpent of Genesis 3? Well, just think about it. In the Old Testament, this term is never applied to the enemy. As time goes on, in the intertestamental period, it occurred to someone, you know that serpent figure back there? He really was hostile to God and to humanity. He's God's adversary. He stood and opposed God. Let's use the word Satan to describe that dude. And by the time you get to the New Testament, this is 400 or 500 years later, it has become on its own a proper noun. So you get a figure who's named Satan. So you have capital S Satan running around doing stuff, and the New Testament associates that figure with the serpent of Genesis 3.
So this is why when Jesus arrives on the scene, he said his primary enemy is not human.
Right. Jesus and his first followers viewed all the pain and suffering in God's good world as a sign of its captivity to death and spiritual evil.
But they didn't think this was the end of the story.
Right. Jesus knew that the only way out of this cosmic ruin is to overcome evil and death itself, even if it costs him everything. And this is, when you read the Gospels, this is what Jesus was constantly talking about.
Yeah.
This is why he didn't start a revolutionary war against Rome.
Because Rome was captive to something greater.
Yeah, he went out to the desert for 40 days to conquer the real enemy that was tempting him to take the kingdom of God over the world, but through violent force.
Yeah.
And he resisted that, and he went about confronting a spiritual enemy that had captured a lot of people's bodies and minds and hearts. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of Luke, and he's getting arrested, he calls it, "This is the time for the power of the dark." That's what he says. And he allows the power of the darkness to overcome him.
You just watched a video in our Spiritual Being series. This one was on the Satan.
And so, with all that in mind, we can now appreciate the full cast of characters that we meet in the biblical story.
God, humans, and all of the spiritual beings.
Exactly. And so here's a preview of what we're going to explore. We'll learn more about God's heavenly staff team called the Divine Council. Then we'll talk about angels and cherubim, key figures in the spiritual realm. We'll also look at the spiritual rebels in the Bible, connected with the Satan and demons. And finally, we'll see how this whole story leads to Jesus, the one who overcomes evil, reunites heaven and earth, so that a new humanity can partner with God.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that. That's just the first of many in a series that I'll be releasing. They're going to help us find the Bible on its own terms in the supernatural focus. Understanding that Satan, our true enemy, doesn't put you into a state of fear. It should understand the enemy that Jesus defeated on our behalf and the story that we find ourselves in. So I hope this encouraged you. Stay tuned. The beginning is near. We have more episodes on this supernatural series coming to you soon. Subscribe. Help us get this message out to others. I'll never ask for a dime. This ministry has been supplied by God and then some, and this is my way of pouring back out into the kingdom. But the number one way you can help this ministry is to subscribe and share the videos if you find them helpful. Thanks so much for being here, and know that you're loved. Ring them bells, y'all. See ya.